Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. For those of you who may not be familiar, the brief chant that Mike just did was an invitation to give a Dhamma reflection. We don't generally start preaching until we're asked. Hopefully not too much preaching anyway. And it just is a little verse that recollects that after the Buddha's enlightenment, there was reluctance on his part to teach, because he realized that what he realized was very, very profound and very subtle, very, very hard to understand and penetrate. And so he was initially inclined to, just not feel like he would put the effort out to try and share the teachings with others. But that thought was picked up by one of the gods of the Brahma world, Sahampati, and this Brahma god realized that the Buddha was inclined not to teach, and became quite concerned, and so he manifested himself in the Buddha's presence and bowed and respectfully asked the Buddha if he would please spread the teaching, spread the Dhamma, because there are people in the world with just a little dust in their eyes, and that they may be able to benefit from these profound teachings. So this verse is recited oftentimes in our monasteries as a formal request for sharing some of the teachings. So, Christmas night, Merry Christmas. Also the new moon, lunar observance in our tradition. Chanted the Patimokkha, the recitation of the Buddha's Vinaya, the Buddhist Vinaya, 227 monks' precepts that we recite every 2 weeks on the full moon and the new moon. So we have these cycles, these occasions that we put in special recognition for, and must be some sort of auspicious movement of the stars that put our new moon on the same day as Christmas. I was contemplating about what to talk about tonight, and also popped into my mind a couple of days ago. We had what we call a bread breakfast, and we have maybe a couple of days a week. There's one of the breakfasts is toast and things like that to help use up some of the bread that we get offered. And I went and put a couple of slices of bread in the toaster and popped it down, and then went to make my tea. And after I was making my tea, letting it steep, I went back to the toaster to see what was going on, and I was looking down there, and the bread was still below the surface of the top, and put my hand over it, and it was sort of warm, not real warm. I kind of sat there looking at it, thinking, well, I also don't look like there's much of a glow, and kind of thinking to myself, oh, well, this must be, some sort of energy-saving, high efficiency toaster or something like that, and I just need to be patient. And then just wasn't doing much, and it was still sort of warm, and I mentioned something or just kind of mumbled something, and it's like, oh, this is just a real low end, energy-saving toaster. And then one of the monks kind of turned around and very kindly said, you need to push it down. It had popped up and I hadn't noticed it. And I kind of, oh, okay. And then noticed a couple of the other monks were smiling very kindly. And I started to think to myself, oh, okay, well, this is the beginning of it all. But was feeling a little embarrassed, but also quite moved by the kindly glances and nice little smiles, compassionate smiles from the other monks for Grandpa Karunadhammo. Thought, well, if it's going to happen, this is the best place for it to happen. Get a few compassionate responses from the youngsters. Seeds of things to come. But, so compassion, how about that for a topic to discuss? And also kind of dovetails with my perception anyway, my memories from growing up and being brought up in a more or less Christian upbringing, but just kind of associating Christ with the notion of compassion. I, brought up in that tradition and had an affinity for religious thought, spiritual thought when I was growing up, and considered myself probably a Christian up until about college, when I started questioning some of it and just some of the aspects of it. Not just Christianity, but just monotheistic religion in general. And then also in college discovered, the religion of materiality and hedonism and all of those religions, and kind of got lost in those for a number of years until I stumbled on to Buddhism, and hit a strong resonance with me. And even though I started questioning some of the basic tenets of at least how I grew up with certain perceptions of God and all of those kinds of things, that even with that movement away from that as my personal belief system, I still retained a sense of appreciation for Christ, at least as a compassionate human being, and felt always moved by stories of compassion, including just sort of this image I was brought up with in Sunday school when I was quite young, of Christ being the healer of children, and surrounded by peaceful animals, and the manger, and sort of a gentle, kind, compassionate presence, and always felt appreciative of that there was that kind of presence in the world, and felt inspired by that, and also just always moved by stories of heroic people giving themselves to help others and giving their lives, that kind of a thing for other people. And not that I never felt like I could actually do a lot of those kind of heroic things, like throwing myself in front of a car to save somebody else's life. You occasionally read about something like that happening, but always felt inspired by that, and particularly with the image of Christ as a helper for beings who are suffering. And in a sense that some of the teachings of some of the Christian traditions talk about Christ having died for our sins, the sins of people, and that in some way or another that I never completely understood, that there was this ability to offer oneself up, offer one's own life, in his case, as a way of expiating the harmfulness that others have put into the world, atonement in a sense. I think I was looking this up earlier today, and there's words for it that's talked about, something like substitution atonement, other things like that. But anyway, it was if it indeed happened in that way, just a very powerful gesture, something that, in a way that we as Buddhists might interpret as a bodhisattva kind of movement or ideal in this person. And of course our teachings on karma point out that actually nobody can really take away somebody else's karma. So the notion of dying to expiate our sins, or in our tradition maybe our unskillful habits, isn't something that can be done. But just that notion or that gesture of that heroic gesture of putting oneself out there because one understands or sees the suffering in the world, it's very noble, and a very noble gesture. So compassion is something that the Buddha talks about as a Brahma Vihara, a sublime abiding, one of the highest places that one can dwell, one of the highest forms of becoming that one can aspire to. And one of the four mature emotions, as Ajahn Sumedho refers to the Brahma Viharas. So it's still a conditioned quality, but one that's amongst the highest that can be attained in the realm of birth and death. Of course, even those very sublime high states that can be attained in these realms are still part of samsara, and full transcendence and realization of nibbana depends on actually letting go of any clinging to those states as well. But not a bad place to dwell if one has to dwell somewhere. So to be compassionate, one really has to be sensitive to and understand suffering, the quality of suffering, dukkha in our language, and a full development of compassion, or even a partial development of compassion, to be effective, useful, has to start with a complete understanding of the Four Noble Truths, which are structured around understanding and penetrating and releasing oneself from dukkha and the causes. So really a deep appreciation, a deep understanding of the fact that there is suffering and what it's all about, that there's a cause for it, the craving for sensuality, the craving for becoming, the craving for annihilation or the craving for non-becoming. All of these are the basic core causes of dukkha, suffering. The fact that there is a possibility of an ending to this kind of suffering, and then the fourth noble truth of the path leading to that, the eightfold path of how we can train ourselves and train the body, train the speech, train the mind with a right form of understanding, and develop a contemplative practice, stilling of the mind, and reflections that lead to wisdom and release from this suffering. So to be compassionate, we really have to understand that there is suffering and that there is this possibility to actually be relieved from it, to transcend it completely. Because how can we, really help somebody if we don't know how to get there ourselves? So many times we're moved in some way to help, and we charge in there to be of assistance. But in the long run, sometimes we only just get in the way because we have ideals and opinions and views about what might be good for somebody else based on what we think, from our own experience is going to be useful. But it's often tinged with a bit of sometimes some self-importance or over-idealized notions. And if we're not careful, we press our compassion onto people and want to make them better according to our standards, make them feel okay according to our standards. So we have to be careful and we have to be wise as we enter into wanting to help others, to make sure that we don't compound the problem or don't get lost in our own biases. So really understanding these Four Noble Truths, and particularly our own suffering, how it is experienced inside each and every one of us as an individual. The first noble truth of dukkha, that there is dukkha, the Buddha says has to be fully penetrated. That's the duty in relation to this first noble truth, the duty to fully penetrate, to fully understand what it is, how we experience this. And it's important to realize that the teachings make a very clear delineation of two kinds of dukkha as the word is used. Sometimes it's used, dukkha, in terms of painful, difficult, very unpleasant conditions of body, speech, mind, of the world of our experience, the six senses that we are all endowed with. That there are some things in the world that are inherently difficult, unpleasant. And these are things like the fact that we're born, that we get older, that we get sick, that we eventually pass away. These are things that are inherent in having a human birth. There's really no solution, in a sense, to that kind of dukkha. Also, the dukkha of having to be around certain situations or stimulations or people that are unpleasant, difficult, being separated from those we want to be around or from the pleasant conditions that we would like to have more of. not being able to attain those. Just not being able to always experience pleasant circumstances and not being able to avoid unpleasant ones. And oftentimes being confused and anxious and fearful and doubtful about the rest of the world. So these are different forms of dukkha, but the ones that we can't really do much of are related to just the inherent birth in this human form and all of its associations. The second kind of dukkha that the Buddha does talk about as the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths is that which we can do something about. And this is where we create a lot of unnecessary suffering for ourselves. We don't have to compound the inherently difficult aspects of our existence with further dukkha of a kind that we don't need to. And this is the dukkha that the Buddha talks about that enters into resistance, avoidance, fear, anxiety, doubt, about unpleasant, unclear, confusing, painful parts of life. Our reaction to those is what creates this second form of dukkha that we don't have to participate in. Or the kind of craving for pleasurable physical and mental experiences as sort of a balm, B-A-L-M, salve for our painful conditions. We repetitively move towards all things pleasant and appealing and desirable in the sensory realm and in the realm of the intellect. And that very craving itself is one that, as we come to understand, is never satisfied. Temporarily satisfied, gives us a bit of pleasure, fades away, as all things do in this realm. So if we repetitively seek happiness there and we don't get it, and we keep on struggling in that way, then that is suffering. That is dukkha, and one of the kinds that we, again, don't have to do. So important to really keep a clear idea of these two kinds, that which we can do something about and that which we cannot. And that in effect, the response to the ones that we cannot is in accepting the way things are, the way life is, and knowing that that is the only answer to preventing that kind of dukkha from arising, or to prevent the second kind of dukkha from arising. So full knowledge of how that works day to day, moment to moment, inside our own hearts, inside our own minds, to be willing to look at this deeply, carefully, because we've just realized that our attempts in the past have not held up. They don't last, and we realize and we search for a longer term kind of happiness through this understanding. And in that process, we have to really own up to this process of the experience of dukkha, of suffering, of unsatisfactoriness. And until we turn towards the beast and say, okay, I'm willing to face this and know this and experience it just as it is without pushing it away. Until we do that, we can't really understand and fully know our own suffering, and therefore we can't really fully understand and know other people's suffering in such a way that we can have compassion in a very intelligent way, very useful way. And until we penetrate that deeply through our willingness to look at ourselves and our experience honestly, until we do that, we can't be fully effective in helping other people. The Buddha also talks about, well, actually it's more in the commentaries, not so much found directly in the canon itself, but in the commentaries there's what are enumerated as enemies of development of compassion. Actually there's these enemies of all the Brahmaviharas, but in particular for compassion there's what's called the far enemy and the near enemy of compassion, of our the enemies being that which obstructs us from being able to experience and know the compassionate qualities of mind. The far enemy of compassion in its extreme form is cruelty, and I would dare to say that probably most of us in the room now don't, at least currently, engage in forms of cruelty to other beings, at least in the grossest ways. Although who knows, what our past might have done. I certainly killed a number of animals in my youth before I understood the impact. But in its extreme form, it's kind of a blind cruelty as a far enemy of compassion. In more subtle forms, it can take even, say, like the forms of indifference, or just ignoring or dissing people, as we would say, as kind of like the opposite quality, or qualities which inhibit the realization or practice, understanding of compassion. How easy it is sometimes, if you're having difficulty with somebody, say, or uncomfortable around a particular person for some reason, how easy it is to kind of just turn away, not look at, avoid contact, because it brings up a sense of discomfort. How many times do we do that? Walk in another direction if somebody we're having trouble with or have some feelings about appears to us, and never fully look at and consider this other being. It was kind of something hit me very strongly once a few years ago when a person associated with our community over the years lives in another part of the country. Anyway, she's an African American woman, and she popped up to the monastery here, and hadn't seen her for a while. A very delightful person, and I saw her and walked up to her and just said, "Oh, nice to see you." Feeling very warm-hearted and kind, and with a twinkle in her eye, she looked back at me and she said, I thought she was going to say something like, "Oh, nice to see you too," but she kind of looked at me with a twinkle in her eye and said, "Nice to be seen." And I thought, that just really hit me, and it wasn't said at all with any kind of, jab or anything like that, but it was just sort of like, oh, this is a person who probably has experienced not being seen a lot through prejudice, and she's wise enough to not be turned by that so much these days, I'm sure, but just the response of "nice to be seen" really hit home to me, and how it's there's so many people who are unseen in the world. For whatever reason, whether it's, those situations of race or gender or whatever it is that people exclude other people for in their lives, or just our general indifference to other beings through our own self-absorption. So we can take that into consideration. That's one of the things that we can look at in terms of causes for our inabilities to fully realize and be compassionate to other beings. The near enemies, the near enemy that is talked about in the commentaries for compassion, it's a quality that is sometimes mistaken. That's why they call it a near enemy. It's a quality that's mistaken for the quality of compassion. And in the commentaries, actually, the one that comes up is I can't remember the exact word in the translation of the Visuddhimagga, but I use the word overwhelm. That kind of sense of being overwhelmed in the face of someone else's suffering, not being able to keep it in perspective, but being buried in that emotional state. Another popular one that I've heard many times and also makes a lot of sense, although I don't think it's directly said that I remember anyway in the commentaries, is the quality or the trait of pity, P-I-T-Y. That sense of, has sort of kind of a condescending quality of, that poor thing doesn't know, how they're suffering, and I have pity for them, So it can be mistaken, a quality of pity or an attitude of pity can be mistaken for compassion. And when I think of the causes for those to arise, what comes to mind for being overwhelmed is not having a very clear discernment about the causes of suffering, and also, not a clear idea of, particularly the causes of suffering. Karma comes to mind, and that people who see the suffering of others and just become unable to bear it, overwhelmed, emotionally distraught, and very emotionally reactive in their own ways, have kind of lost a perspective, lost a balance, and particularly I think have lost the balance of knowing what is helpable and what is inherent, maybe not having the perspective of the fact that there is the karma of being a human being, that there is the karma that is ripening from past actions, and not to be used in any kind of judgmental way or dismissive way. That's so important when we talk about and consider the law of karma and the sources of suffering, the results from past actions, both good and bad, but having a very clear understanding that there are different kinds of dukkha, and that for us not to get overwhelmed, we have to see it in its fullest, in its full perspective, still with an attitude of wanting to help, wanting to relieve. But how can we be effective if we are ourselves overwhelmed and not seeing clearly? That's not a good basis for compassionate action. So wisdom is lacking. And I think of the kind of other near enemy that sometimes use, pity. kind of relates in my mind to the quality of conceit, a sense of me in relationship to somebody else, and that in a way, in some way I am better than they are, so I should feel sorry for them, implies that sense of superiority in a subtle way. So if we want to develop further our sense of compassion, in addition to really understanding our own dukkha, it might be useful to also really consider some antidotes, say to the near enemy of overwhelm, and to really understand the law of karma, in that we inherit the results of past actions, whether it's in this life, in previous lives, and that just accepting the truth of the fact that there is cause and effect, and that eventually we do experience the results of past actions of body, speech, and mind. And that in a way there's very little control over that process, and it's very, very complicated and hard to fathom, and the Buddha is very careful about saying that that it's so complex with so many factors, good karma, bad karma, ripening at almost inconceivably unknown periods of time, that to try and understand it in a conceptual way is pretty near impossible. And that the truth is that even though we can't control the results as they manifest, we do have this very unique ability, particularly as human beings, to know how to respond when there is karma ripening. We do not have to compound it with further ignorance, further actions based on greed, hatred, and delusion. We do not have to compound it. We do experience the results at some level, but we can learn how to receive it in a way that not only does not compound it, but also doesn't result in the second kind of dukkha, the second kind of suffering, of resistance, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. That this is the teaching on the law of karma. So fully understanding that, contemplating that, accepting that, is a way to overcome this sense of overwhelm. And that's when compassion starts to become imbued with wisdom. We see somebody who's suffering, and we're able to discern, because we've been able to see it in ourselves, where it is that we can help and where it is that we can't, where it is that they can address the pain and difficulty in their own lives in a way that results in release and relief from the kinds of dukkha that are avoidable. And we focus our attention on helping where we can, and helping others to accept certain circumstances that may not be amenable to any kind of alleviation. We do that with wisdom, and we do that with that genuine wish based on our own experience, and our own acceptance of that which we cannot change. And we work towards allowing other people to be in a space with us where they can face those things that are unavoidable, and adopt attitudes and see for themselves how to learn not to react in the ways that bring on more suffering for them. So it's through our own understanding, through our own knowledge of our own suffering, of the knowledge of karma, that which is avoidable, that which is unavoidable, that gives us the basis not to be overwhelmed and lost in somebody else's suffering. And to help avoid that kind of comparison of self and others that's at the basis of conceit as an obstruction to compassion, then slowly start to question and whittle away at this very strong perception of me as the center of everything, the universe, the basis of self-concern, self-involvement, self-preoccupation that is ingrained in most of us, but is treatable too. You start to consider how not to personalize these kinds of universal qualities. There's a story of Stephen Levine, who was actually a very good friend of Ram Dass, who we just heard passed away. I hadn't heard that until this evening. Stephen Levine studied with Ram Dass for a long time, worked with him very closely on some of their compassion projects, and did a lot of work with people who were dying. And just remember a story from one of his books where a woman who was in pain and difficulty, suffering with terminal cancer, and was getting much closer to dying, was just caught in so much suffering, having such a difficult time accepting, dealing with, coming to terms with the illness and its implications for the end of her life, and suffering greatly for that. And that in the process of, having to face it, having to deal with it, slowly having to come to accept it on its own terms, her moment of, you call it, a realization of some sort, very deep, deep insight, came when she was in the throes of some personal suffering, all the questions of why me, why this, why now, and some images appeared in her mind of all the other beings in the world who were suffering, all the vast, uncountable ways that humans experience suffering in the world. And as these visions came to her, she had this very deep insight of, this isn't my suffering. What I'm feeling now isn't my suffering. It's the suffering. It's just part of what all beings at some level experience. And I don't need to do this to myself, because this is just part of being human being. This is the suffering. So learning how to depersonalize all the things that come to us with difficulty in the world doesn't make it go away, but it means that we can be just much more at peace with it in its own form. So reducing this conceit of me, I am, this is mine. And also just to, as we walk through the world, working with all of this internally ourselves and hoping to be able to attend in a skillful way, in a compassionate way with others, just starting to look around us a little more too, trying to come out of our own shells of self-absorption and looking, just actually looking at other people, considering that they, just like me, they have their difficulties, they have their problems, they have their pains, they have their obstructions, and they may be of a different flavor, of a different type, but it all ends up in the same place. And that we all have the same work to do when it comes right down to it. We have to be attentive to our own particular forms of how it all manifests, but realizing that really everyone experiences this noble truth of suffering. And to open our eyes and to be sensitive to that, to be receptive to that, to be considerate of that when we find ourselves caught in judgment or anger or all the other defenses that we can bring up in relation to the world around us. To just open our eyes, look around, and really being able to receive, put ourselves in other people's place, see things from, try to see things from other people's perspective the best we can, and to develop that sense of, well, just as I want to be free from suffering, they do too. So let's see what we can all do to figure this out together. So, Christmas night, here at Abhayagiri, a few thoughts about compassion, and leave it there for tonight's reflection.